I suppose you all know Nora Owen. Literally no need to be introduced. From Malahide, former Minister for Justice, but also a member of what was called the Democracy Commission here a few years ago. So she brings other insights. And just to add one little extra thing, she's just back from observing the elections in Pakistan. So she'll have lots of fascinating things to say about that. But this really is to be, again, an interactive session with the floor. But given that our three eminent academics, you've heard them all up to now, maybe we'll ask Nora to have some. By the way, we will be having shortly, I think, the ballot papers to be distributed. Are they ready? Could we distribute them now? And then people will vote at the coffee break, which will come after this panel discussion.
Okay. Get the ballots. Can I stay here?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wait, just while they're distributing
That's
the
grand.
things. Yeah. So Nora, where would you like to start in terms of your?
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, former colleagues, and may I give you a warm welcome to Malahide, as I am a resident here since 1969. And please do come back again when you're finished in this convention to visit us. There's a festival on next weekend, incidentally, and you might like to join in that. I've been here most of the day, and it's been fascinating, and I've, suppose, participated in my long time in politics in many discussions such as this here today. I bear the scars and the joys of 12 elections on my back, including the electronic voting, and I was very disappointed when I wasn't invited to the actual dismantling of those machines. I had offered to be present at the funeral and the burial, but somebody decided they didn't want it. My son tried very hard to buy me one of the machines as a birthday present, but it didn't work out, and I was kind of glad in a way. But as Tom says, I am just back from Pakistan, and maybe we've heard such a lot of information here today. It might be good just for a second to share with you some experiences of there. Pakistan is a country that has about a 56% literacy level, but effectively it's probably only about 40% because they measure if you can write your name as you're literate. So when you consider that in Pakistan there were 15,629 candidates, there were 69,801 polling stations, there were 645,000 polling staff, 600,000 security personnel, and there was a great deal of both pre-election and during election violence, and still 60% of the people of the 86 million registered voters came out to vote. And shame on us when we have all the advantages we have that we're only just about hitting that kind of level as well for elections. To be a candidate in the Pakistani election, they have a very effective electoral commission, and I'll come back to that, but they set down how candidates would be scrutinised to become a candidate. So it was a public system. And in order to qualify to be to register as a candidate, wait for it, you had to be sagacious, righteous, non-profligate, honest, trustworthy, not having or your spouse or dependents defaulted on a loan of 2 million rupees, which is about $20,000 or more for more than a year, and not having defaulted on the payment of utilities or government dues in excess of 10,000 rupees, which is about $1,000. Additionally, Article 62 and 63 of the Constitution said that Muslim candidates must possess adequate knowledge of Islamic teachings, be of good character, and not be commonly known as one who violates Islamic injunctions. And then non-Muslims were required to be of good moral reputation. Now, I'm looking around at the politicians that are here. I trust you have ticked every one of those boxes in whatever form you're in. But a challenge was taken because the district returning officers who were responsible for deciding on the candidates had a kind of a fairly free hand. They shouldn't have had a free hand, but they took a free hand. And so a court case ensued by some candidates, sadly a bit late for anything to happen. And I just thought you'd like to hear some of the questions that were asked during the hearings to certify a candidate. In which situations does a bath become mandatory for married Muslims? Do you believe in honeymoons? Have you stood in front of a girls' college ever in your life? If you are dying with thirst in a desert and get a bottle of alcohol, would you drink it? Now, this obviously would be for Muslims. If in a river, a great religious scholar, your wife and son are drowning, and you can only save one, whom would you save? And especially for the women, if you win the elections, won't it disturb the lives of your husband, kids, and in-laws? Now, they were the kind of questions that were asked in order to qualify people as a candidate. And so it gives you an idea of perhaps the simplicity of our system in a lot of ways and the complexity of other systems. I, as Tom said, sat on the Democracy Commission for 2 years. This was a body made up of people of various skills. And we issued a very extensive report. And some of the recommendations in that report, I'm glad to say, have now been put in place. But there are one or two that I think have not been put in place, which I think, in the discussion about electoral reform, that really, I think, as the Kerryman says, if you want to get somewhere, I wouldn't be starting from here. In my 25 years or more in politics, I don't think the actual electoral system was really an issue that frustrated and annoyed people, nor did it frustrate or create apathy and frustration in the actual elected people, because the citizens can be frustrated and apathetic, but so too can the elected politicians after they're elected. So in consideration of whether you change an electoral system, you need to look at the wider things that are creating the A word, and not the A word that I sat in the Senate chamber yesterday listening with Jerry Buttimer chairing. It's the apathy word, because that's the thing that really, deadens the whole system here. And two of the areas that were not taken up from the Democracy Commission report and have been mentioned here today is the whole education of people. We recommended that the programme that's taught in schools up to junior cert level, should be extended to leaving cert, and it should become an actual exam subject. 14 and 15-year-olds get very enthusiastic about our system. They carry on elections in their classrooms. They invite politicians to come and talk to them, full of enthusiasm. By the time they reach 18, when they can go onto the register, they've forgotten all about it and they don't go onto the register and therefore don't participate. And that seems to be, quite frankly, stupid if we want to get more people involved in the electoral system, either at a citizenship level or at an elected level. And I really do think that that's a recommendation that needs to be taken up. The second recommendation we made, and I know in 2008, Richard Sinnott and others prepared a report for the then government on the setting up of an electoral commission. I saw the electoral commission working in a country like Pakistan, where the laws had been changed so that the selection of the people on it were open and independent. The government did not have the say as to who would be there. The opposition and the government parties decided on who would chair that and who the other four commissioners would be. And that commission is charged with all the aspects of election, between, during and after an election. And our difficulty here in this country is we tend to do the old Irish solution for the Irish problem. Something is wrong, so we set up, a small group or somebody to take charge of that. So SIPO, Standards in Public Office, is set up. And then we have the county councils and they do the register, but they don't really do it in between elections. And then we have the Department of Environment doing other aspects of it. If you set up an electoral commission, you could put all these bodies together into that with all the responsibilities. And then you could have a more effective system where there'd be ongoing education, where community groups could get money for capacity building in their community, where the citizens would actually become more engaged. And really, what's missing, I think, in our system very often is the citizenship application. If something goes wrong in your area and somebody wants to build a sewage treatment plant, your citizens will rise up to say no to that. But before you get to that point, shouldn't the citizens also be engaged in why you need a sewage treatment plant in your area and why it can't be 55 miles away in somebody else's community to get rid of your sewage? And, you know, by the time the councils make the decision, then the row is, we're not having it in our place. In 1999, 67% of the people between 18 and 25 did not vote in the council elections. Now they are the 30-somethings now whose lives, families, their children are completely predicated on what their councils do around them. And yet, at a time when they could have had a say, back when they were 18 or 20, they just said, it's not for me. So, I mean, they lost the opportunity perhaps to interface with the councils then. So I think in any consideration here today of the electoral system, I think you need to you know, set down what are the things that really drive you mad. Is it the way decisions are made? Even today you can see how difficult it is to reach a decision when you have people with a whole lot of different views. That same process exists, let me tell you, at cabinet table. And it doesn't matter whether it's a single party or a coalition. If it's a single party or coalition, there still will be differences of opinion. And somebody at the end of the day has to make that decision, having taken on board the wisdom of the whole cabinet. And that's only 15 people. Here we're talking about a much bigger group. So in reaching decisions, I think we are obliged as citizens, and I'm now a citizen as opposed to an elected politician, we're obliged to inform ourselves, and eventually if a decision is made, to hope that you can accept that decision was made with proper consultation and investment by people. I think I'll just finish by raising an issue that I know has, well, just very quickly, 1977, 75.5% of the people went out to vote. Consistently every year since then, the voting pattern has gone down. So in 2002, it was 62%, so it was 13% less. Slight blip in 2011 for various reasons, because we were in the middle of the recession and there was a real interest. But the other figure that I think is interesting is that in 1977 only 7% voted for what's called others, but by 2011 that had grown to 12.6. Now that's a message that I heard somebody at this side of the room saying, that it's part of the frustration that people don't think the political parties can actually help them in running the country and doing things that they want to do. You know, we all as citizens have a responsibility. It isn't just left to the politicians. And can we examine our conscience every day and say, I didn't bother getting in touch about that. I didn't bother attending that public meeting. It's somebody else's problem. I think if we examine our conscience, we'll find that a lot of us do sit back and let somebody else make the decision, and we just give out about it when it's all over. So, as I say, look carefully before an electoral system is blamed as the reason why we all feel at times very apathetic. Thank you very much.
Very good. Laura, thanks very much indeed. Okay, the floor is open now to any comments. And again, I will try to take people whose voices haven't been heard up to now today. Well, you've been heard already. Terence first then.
Thanks very much, Chairman, and just to thank our experts for their excellent presentations. Just following on Nora's point there regarding decision making, can I just ask the panel regarding voting within, say, national parliaments, and particularly within political parties in Parliament, and say the use of the three-line party whip. Can I just ask, how do we compare, say, internationally and particularly against the UK Parliament regarding the use of a three-line party whip versus, say, allowing free votes on certain issues? Are we behind in not allowing, say, free votes on social issues or matters of conscience, or should we be ignoring our conscience on certain issues?
Okay, thank you. Aon? Could we have the mic here, Mary? Thanks. And then Joanna, yeah. sorry.
Thanks, on the Rudan. I just want to ask the panel just on the issue of compulsory voting or required voting. Michael, you mentioned the ballot paper and the reason why it has changed over time to include photographs and party symbols in that. Well, I think that was as a result of a NALA campaign because of the high level of adult illiteracy in Ireland. The literacy levels, the functional illiteracy levels amongst Irish adults is actually 23%. And most of those people actually don't vote. And the reason why I'd be an advocate for discussing at least the idea of compulsory voting is because, the areas that don't vote as much are the ones who need politics more. And the resources of the state tend to, over a period of time, this is my own view, graduate towards those who vote more. Older people vote more, and richer people vote more. Poorer people don't vote as much because they're disconnected from the system. They don't see the system working for them. And younger people don't. And younger people, therefore, are often ignored by the political system because they don't vote in the same numbers. And if you look at the amount of investment we put in, for example, into preschool versus into the amount of investment we put into the over 70s, it's quite remarkable. So the reason why I would be an advocate for compulsory voting and to possibly get your view on what happens in Australia and Belgium as well is to see how it works there and the reasons behind that. Was it, as I believe it was, in order to re-engage those who don't vote into voting, and also obviously to give them the opportunity to, go into the ballot box and spoil their vote if they want to, or to say none of the above. They have a right not to vote for anybody, but they still have to take part in the process. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm going to take a couple more. There's Joanna, and then Michelle, and then Sorcha. Okay.
Thank you. I just wanted to raise the issue of the tables presented by Adrian. And I have a question arising out of it, but one of the things that strikes me is that if we had the mixed member system, which is often the alternative that's proposed by people, 17 TDs that were elected to the current Dáil would not have been elected. So basically, the Socialist Party, which won 2 seats, would have won no seats. The People Before Profit, which won 2 seats, would have won no seats. Instead of 13 independents, there would have been 11 independents. And basically smaller parties and independents would be wiped out under the mixed members system according to this analysis, and I think that's a very important point. But the other point, which is not in this paper, which I think is very important, was made by Professor Michael Laver to the All-Party Committee on the Constitution a few years back, and he went and he did a similar kind of exercise in relation to the 2002 election. And what he found was, in a mixed member seat system at the time, Fianna Fáil, as the biggest party, would have cleaned up all the constituency seats so that the Labour Party and Sinn Féin, even though Sinn Féin appears to come out of this quite well, they would not win constituency seats. They would be making up the difference through list seats. And in that regard, in Wales, when they surveyed voters in 2004 as part of an electoral commission which recommended bringing in our system, they found that the voters looked down on the MPs that were elected through the list system. They thought the real MPs were the ones elected from constituencies. So, I suppose I would like to get the breakdown. I think if Adrian could give us a breakdown, how many seats would Labour or Sinn Féin have got in constituencies and how many on the list?
Okay, I'm not sure that Adrian may be gone, but anyway, Michelle, and then Sorcha, and then we go back to the panel. Yeah,
thank you, Chairman, and also for the very informative discussion we're having here. Just obviously coming from the perspective that we're having this discussion to see how we can make better, if possible, our political system and make it more representative and improve it in whatever way we can. I see already that we have a problem from my point of view, and it's there's a lady up here and she made reference to the fact that we're going to be 8 TDs less the next time round, and she argued for more, but that's not where I'm coming from. The way I see it is that of those 8 TDs, 5 of those are going to be from the Western Seaboard. So what we see then is that actually the west of the country, or the more rural areas, are the areas that are predominantly losing representation. Couple that with the fact that those areas, many of them, and in the case of my own county, which is Mayo, we're losing councils, we're losing councillors, and then you see in the cities and the major areas of population, there is an increase in the number of councillors. So I see that there's going to be less democratic representation in the rural areas. And considering they have, there's a big geography involved, they have a particular identity, and I think that what I'm putting forward is recognised in other jurisdictions, and I think maybe the UK is one. It was pointed out to me before that, for example, an MP in London might have a lot more constituents than maybe one in the Hebrides, recognising that the Hebrides is a lot different, and so on. But also too, and it's not just theoretical, I think down through the years, a feature of debate has always been balanced regional development. And the reason that is the case is that it has been traditionally the situation that the areas I'm referring to along the western seaboard have not benefited from the same investment from an infrastructural point of view, whether it's roads, whether it's our national transmission electricity grids and so on. So therefore, we have people who are going to have less councillors, less TDs, we have a massive geographical spread and unique issues and concerns, as there are in cities, but cities are better serviced in many ways. So I just see that there's a lessening of the democratic representation in these areas, which I don't think is the right way forward. I would like to see maybe us follow in the vein of jurisdictions that recognise the nuances and the needs of areas, because the problem with balanced regional development has not gone away. And if I just say it, and it's not about, oh, the West, God help us around, it's nothing like that. We've got resources that we want to work with, but they need infrastructural investment, etc., and that requires political representation. And my concern is that it's going the wrong direction, and that needs to be addressed in terms of how we conduct our electoral system and the amount of constituents required per TD.
Okay, thanks very much.
And also considering we're looking at abolishing the Seanad. So,
okay.
Thank you.
Zorka, and then we're going to go to the panel, and then we'll come back to the next round of comments.
Zorka O'Neill. Normally I wouldn't be in favour of as a nanny state, as it was put earlier on, but I do believe the compulsory voting would solve a number of problems, one of which Nora pointed out, the voter apathy. I think that compulsory voting would force both the state and society to look at our political system more closely than it's already looking at it. I think it would encourage greater participation on a civic level as well. I think it would also encourage, you'd get that more difference of a mix for upcoming TDs or local councillors. I think on those three fronts, it would be a positive thing for compulsory voting. The huge downside to that is that with most things that are compulsory, there's a penalty clause if you don't comply. And I believe there is a huge proportion in our prison systems today, people that are, the highest proportion of people in prison today are due to non-payment of fees due to TV license, not paying your TV license, or traffic fines, things like that. So, and that our prison system is already well overburdened as it is. So making it compulsory by penalty of fee or fine or imprisonment would already would create a further problem on our prison system. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you. It would be a novel thing that we send people to jail for not voting. But anyway, Michael, we go across the. You may, whatever it is you want to address. We've had a good. Yeah, I'm coming to you, Charlie, and David as well. But let's take comments here first before we forget.
Okay. Well, I'll pick and choose which ones
Yeah.
I deal with then. And one issue was whether there should be more TDs per head of population in some parts of the country than others, and that does happen in some countries, as was mentioned. An MP in the UK representing the Western Isles would represent far fewer people than an MP in many other parts of Britain. The Constitution here doesn't allow that. In fact, Fianna Fáil, as some people might vaguely remember from 50 years ago, did try and bring in a scheme of constituencies in the early 1960s, under which some areas would have had more TDs per head of population than others, and that was struck down by the Supreme Court, and there now has to be the same ratio right across the country. And the defence of that really is that, firstly, that everyone's vote should be equal. You shouldn't have fewer TDs or less representation simply because you live in an urban area than in a rural area. And in addition to that, in all countries, including this country, political voting patterns tend to be different in urban areas than rural ones. So in this country, for example, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael tend to do better in rural areas, And the other parties, especially Labour, better in urban areas. So if rural areas were overrepresented, then Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael would tend to get more seats per vote, and Labour would tend to get fewer seats per vote. So there would be political consequences to that. I'll just mention briefly, other people might say more about the idea of the party whip. I'm not that familiar with how often it's waived, but it has to be said that the party whip and the idea of MPs of parties voting en bloc on every issue, that is the norm throughout Europe. There are some people who say it's very unusual in Ireland, and in other countries, it's up to MPs' conscience as to which way to vote on particular issues. But in fact, it's not. The solidarity of political party voting right across Europe is extremely high, regardless of the electoral system. In the Netherlands, for example, there's a provision in the constitution that says that every MP votes according to their conscience. No other body can direct them in how to vote, from which you might imagine that MPs pick and choose, and there's a free vote on every issue. But there isn't. It's right at the other extreme that when they hold votes in the Dutch Parliament, the party whip says we're in favour of it. And if that party has 36 seats, that's 36 votes in favour of the motion. Individual MPs don't even get to vote as individuals. So the fact that in this country nearly every TD votes the party line on nearly every issue, that is in fact the norm for Western Europe. So, okay, thanks, Chairman.
I might just take up Joanna's question about Adrian's paper. As you'll see in the paper itself, there's warning notes to be attached, and I think it's worth stressing the warning notes. So, you know, the simulations that he and Noel have brought forward are simulations based on their assumptions. A different group of people might have used different assumptions and got different election results. So that would be one warning note. But I think the even more important warning note is they're carrying out an experiment based on an election that happened in the past using a different electoral system with a whole slate of candidates who were running in that electoral system. If you were to change the electoral system tomorrow, you have different kinds of people who'd be interested in coming into politics potentially, who, you know, new system, I might try that out. You'd have different parties campaigning in different contexts because now they have a better chance or a lesser chance. You've got a different kind of campaign going on. You've got different ways people are going to cover politics. So there's massive warning notes. It's a wonderful exercise that Adrian and Noel have done, but it's just a wonderful exercise. That's as far as I would take it. It's just an illustration and no more than that. In terms of the compulsory voting, Zorka and Dayon both raised that question. I know in the case of Australia, they brought in compulsory voting in the early 1900s. And that's for me is a telling point that if you actually look at the few countries among the established democracies that have it, that still have it, and if you look at the other countries that have adopted it, they're all new democracies. It's something when you're a new system, when you're an establishing democracy to go for compulsory voting. It's quite another thing for a party leader to stand up tomorrow and say, hey folks, let's bring in compulsory voting, because that will not be a popular measure in some quarters. That would be a highly risky move. There are a lot of people in this room who may be very enthusiastic about going out to vote, but there's a whole lot of other people who would actually be deeply offended by the state forcing them to vote. And that's a question that needs to be considered if you're going to open up the issue of compulsory voting. It does sound like a good idea, and research does tend to show that if you really want to magic greater turnout, compulsory voting is probably the best way to do that. But it does come with potentially very huge costs in terms of public support for the political system.
Thanks, David. Michael, whatever you'd like to pick.
Maybe just take up the compulsory voting a little bit more. As I said before, there are different arguments for it. I think if you see turnout in itself as really important, well, clearly compulsory voting delivers you turnout. But I think you have to ask, well, why do we want turnout to be high? Do we want turnout to be high because that means that citizens get involved? Well, just because they have to vote doesn't mean that they'll get involved. Doesn't mean that they have to know what they're doing. But we know normally that people who go along and vote in referendums, particularly those who vote no, often say, well, I didn't know what this was about, so I voted no. So they voted, they turned up, but did they really make a responsible democratic decision? That's another issue altogether. I do think there's a good case for saying, well, as I said before, for ensuring that parties do try and mobilise across society and direct programmes to all sorts of sectors of society, and they can ignore people if they don't vote. That's one of those sort of suppositions that I've never seen investigated really systematically. I did do some research once to say, well, what would happen if everybody voted? And we explored by various simulations how elections in different countries would have turned out had more people voted. And that was partly by predicting how they would have voted by reference to other people who looked the same. And what we found, for the most part, is it didn't make any difference to the results. And in particular, it didn't make the sort of difference that many people thought, that it would strengthen the left, because the left was full of the marginalised groups that normally don't vote. It didn't. There was absolutely no evidence that that would have happened. All that happened is that turnout would have been higher. So what would you claim? Well, we have a really good democracy because turnout's high. No, because turnout is a sense that people are really involved and excited. But if it's compulsory, they're not necessarily involved. I mean, I think if you want to get turnout up, then either make politics determine more things. So if it really matters to the world who wins the next election, you'll get high turnout. But do you really want a party system that's so polarised that if A wins, you'll get this, and if B wins, you'll get something very different? The further apart the alternative governments are, the higher turnout's likely to be. But is that really what we want? That's really a sort of majoritarian winner gets all system, which may be quite good for turnout. But is that really what we mean by democracy?
Okay. Thanks, Michael. Nora, you have
Yeah,
comments?
just on the three-line party whip, it's an issue that generally only comes up for discussion when there is the issue, for example, of the protection of life in pregnancy, those issues with the three-letter word sex involved somewhere in it. I have to be frank about it. Otherwise, nobody says, well, I'd like a freedom to vote on whether or not we increase social welfare or decrease social welfare. So if you're in a party, even though it might sound very disciplinarian, I mean, a three-line whip, you're in the party and the place you try to change the policy is in your party room, and if you don't succeed there, well, you don't succeed in one issue, you accept it, you swallow that decision, and as I had to do all through my life, there were things that I wished had been differently decided by the party, but they weren't, and then you go along. And if you don't abide by the party whip, you equally have the rules set down as to what the discipline sanction is after that. So I think the three-line party whip is a protection, and it also allows decisions to be made, and very often it's a protection for people who have a different view than what the party has taken, but they go back to their constituency and say, look, I fought the good fight, I didn't succeed in changing my party colleagues to a different view, and I went along with the party whip. When you get to the issue of compulsory voting, I think there's a step back from that before it, and that is, should there be compulsory registration on the electoral register? And this has been debated several times. Remember, we had hot discussions on it. You know, is being on the register a sort of human right? Can you make a decision that I don't want to be on the electoral register? You know, it's not I don't want to be on it. Or should, once you get your PPS number at 18, should there be a central register where automatically then that is distributed when an election comes up to the different councils? It's up to them to check where your current address is. Because there's huge frustration when people come to vote and they find they're not on the register. And when I challenge them, they say, well, I should be on the register. And I said, well, did you fill in a form and send it in? No, I didn't, but I got my PPS number and I should be on it. So again, there's a gap there in what the citizen understands as their responsibility to go on the register. So I would like to see some mechanism and discussion about perhaps an ongoing register that perhaps allows your name to go on it. Because the people who get the 20-year-olds who make an effort to come to the polls and then find they're not on the register because their mammy and daddy didn't put them on the register and they weren't in when the council called and the form came in the door and it got thrown into the basket like all the other rubbish that comes in the front door. You know, that's the way a lot of people see it, and so they're not on the register. So I think before you get to compulsory voting, look at whether you need to have compulsory automatic registration. The whole issue that Joanne has raised about sort of reserve, you know, special seats, reserve seats and all the rest, there is, and it's the same argument in quotas. You know, are you treated differently if you're there standing beside a colleague and you've got your seat through a more favourable methodology of getting elected? And this was actually heavily discussed in Pakistan as well, because there are 60 reserve seats for women and they had to go through a separate selection, and then depending on the percentage their party got, they got a seat. But there is still great kind of feeling that, well, they're only women in the reserve seat. There was precisely 2% of women who stood for the general seats, because the attitude of the parties was, well, you have your own little caucus over there with your 60 seats. So it just gave me another view. With regard to what Michelle is talking about, Article 16.2.4 says, the Oireachtas shall revise the constituency at least once every 12 years with due regard to changes in distribution of the population, but any alterations don't come in till after. And my reading of that is, with due regard to changes in the distribution of the population, is probably saying if there's a bigger population somewhere, you increase the seats there. It doesn't seem to imply the reverse, that if there's a reduction in the population, you increase the seats there. So there may be a constitutional problem in trying to up the number of seats in the rural area to take account of the kind of issues that Michelle has raised. And there was one point, incidentally, Sorcha, the biggest proportion of prisoners are not in our prisons because of non-payment of fines. There are quite a few people who go in for short periods of time, but rules have been changing and there are other methods. I'm afraid the biggest proportion of our people in prison are because of quite serious crimes generally. One thing I forgot to mention, and can I use it now? The role of the media in our political system, and the kind of criticism, and I don't want to go back to the Shannon debate, but the sort of criticisms that ensue if a politician dares to change their mind and say, well, I've reviewed what I said before the election, or even on our programme for government, and I've decided in the fullness of time, I won't use the old expression that was used before, but in looking again at what I said, I actually think a change, I'm going to change my opinion on that. And the minute somebody does that, it's a U-turn, it's weakness, it's, how dare you, you said this 4 years ago, you said it 3 years ago, and now here you are changing your mind. We all have the right to change our mind. And if politicians don't have the right to review something again and change their mind on what they're doing, particularly the people who are charged with making the decisions, then we're all in a bad way, because, things change. I mean, even that constitutional thing that I read out, with due regard to changing circumstances, changing population. Why shouldn't politicians be able to say, I've thought about this again and I'm changing my mind, without being castigated? And I'm sending that message out to the media, because it was a problem I often felt was very difficult to handle when you were in politics, that the minute you said, well, actually, I've decided to do something different than what I said last year, you are taken as being weak. So just message to the media.